Hi, I'm Dave Rand. I'm an associate professor of management science and brain and cognitive sciences at MIT. And I'm going to tell you today about some work I've been doing with my co-author, Gord Pennycook, who's at the University of Regina in Canada, about the problem of misinformation. Before I start, I want to get some definitions out of the way. When I say fake news or false news, I don't mean anything I disagree with. But I'm specifically talking about entirely fabricated stories that are presented as if they're legitimate factual news. And this kind of misinformation has gotten the lion's share of the attention in recent years, but it's not the only kind of misinformation, and you might argue it's not even necessarily the most important. Another class of misinformation that we've been thinking a lot about is hyperpartisan news, which is biased or misleading interpretation or coverage of events that did actually happen. And I think that this is probably more widespread and perhaps more pernicious than fake news, but both of them are problems. And what we want to try and understand is, first of all, a basic question in terms of basic science of why is it that people fall for misinformation? And then the more applied question of what can we do to actually prevent the spread of misinformation? So starting with the basic science question, there's a sort of dominant narrative in both the popular press and the academic literature, which is captured by headlines like this: the real story about fake news is partisanship, the partisan brain, things like that. And this line of argument says, for these headlines that it seems like people should be able to figure out aren't true or aren't reliable, the reason they fail to do so is because your reasoning abilities get hijacked by your partisan identity. And instead of using reasoning to uncover the truth, you just use it to entrench your beliefs and protect your identity. And that could be the case, but it's not the only possibility. It might also be the case that reasoning does actually usually help us uncover the truth. And the problem is just that people don't bother to think, and they just go with their partisan defaults without stopping to think more carefully. We wanted to try and distinguish between these two different accounts of falling for misinformation. And so we ran a series of experiments looking at the relationship between how good people were at assessing the truth of the news that they're reading, what we'll call media truth discernment, and how much they engage in careful reasoning and analytic thinking versus just going with their gut. And that's because this relationship, you get different predictions by the two accounts. By the motivated reasoning account, there should be a negative relationship, because people who are better at engaging in reasoning are better able to trick themselves. They're better able to convince themselves to believe false stories that align with their ideology and to discredit true stories that don't. On the other hand, if reasoning does actually just help you uncover the truth, and the problem is people failing to reason, then you'd expect a positive relationship. People that engage in more reasoning are just better at understanding what's true and what's not true. So in order to tell these two accounts apart, we had people rate the veracity of a series of stories presented in Facebook format like this: a picture, a title, a lead sentence, and then we say, do you think this headline describes an event that actually happened in an accurate and unbiased way? And based on those responses, we can see how good they are at telling what's true and credible from what's hyperpartisan or false. And then we measure how inclined they are to engage in reasoning by having them complete the cognitive reflection test, which is this series of questions with intuitively compelling but wrong answers. For example, consider this one. When you're running a race and you pass the person in second place, what place are you in? First comes naturally to mind, and you might just write that down, or you might introspect for a minute and realize, oh no, wait, when you pass the person in second place, then you're in second place. And the key experimental question for us then is, what's the relationship between how well people do on this test, which I'll show on the x-axis, and how accurate they rate the different kinds of headlines, which I'll show on the y-axis. This data, this particular data set is from 485 Americans, but we've replicated this many times, although mostly with Americans. And so, okay, what do we find? You see this very clear, striking relationship where people that do better on the cognitive reflection test, who engage in more reasoning, are better at differentiating real from false or hyperpartisan, driven mostly by them being less likely to believe the false stories or the hyperpartisan stories. Importantly, this is totally equivalent regardless of whether the headlines align with their ideology or not. So again, this is suggesting it's not about motivated reasoning and political motivations overcoming reasoning. It's also robust to controlling for age, gender, education, ideological conservatism, and raw numerical ability, which suggests it really is about this tendency to stop and think versus just going with your default. And we also find this isn't just true of what happens in our online studies, but if we look at people's actual Twitter IDs after we have them do the CRT, we similarly find that people that engage in more reasoning share news from higher quality news outlets. So when you take all of this together, it suggests that this story is actually wrong. And it's not that our reasoning abilities are held captive, it's just that we don't bother to think. So it's more about lack of reasoning than it is about motivated reasoning. Nonetheless, this still is a problem that people are believing false content and people are sharing false content. So it raises the question of what to do about it. I'll start with the sort of perhaps most obvious seeming thing, which is also the first thing that Facebook did in the wake of the 2016 presidential election, which is taking a false headline like this and putting a warning on it. This is disputed by third-party fact checkers. But I think that there are reasons to believe that this approach is not going to be, in general, effective, which is essentially a problem of scalability. There's just no way that third-party fact checkers are going to be able to keep up with the endless stream of false or misleading content being produced because it's so much easier to produce false content than it is to fact check it. What this means is that many, if not most, false stories will never wind up getting flagged in the first place. And even the ones that do, it takes time. So while they're in peak virality and spreading phase, they won't have a warning on them. Not only does this mean that the warning won't have a chance to be effective, but this thing that we've identified called the implied truth effect suggests there may actually be some negative perverse effects of this, because if you label some content as false, it makes people believe that all of the other content that's not labeled might be true and increases the perceived accuracy of the other content. So labeling some fake content will make the other content seem more believable. So if that's not the approach that I think is going to be a success, the question is, what should we be doing? And I'm going to briefly describe two different things that I think might be more promising. One of them is using crowdsourcing of lay people to identify reliable versus unreliable news outlets, and then increasing the visibility of content from trusted outlets, or actually more importantly, decreasing the visibility of content from outlets that everybody agrees are untrustworthy. Now, you might not think that this works because you might be worried that people are blinded by partisanship again, and so they're going to say that the outlets they trust the most are the most partisan outlets rather than the most reliable outlets. And so to test this, we had 970 Americans indicate their familiarity with and trust in 60 different news outlets, 20 mainstream, which I'll show in green, 20 hyperpartisan, which I'll show in orange, and 20 fake news outlets, which I'll show in red. We're going to have 1 dot per outlet, with the average trust among Democrats on the x-axis and average trust among Republicans on the y-axis. What you see is there are some clear partisan differences, like the Republicans trust Fox way more than they trust everything else, including other right-leaning mainstream outlets like the Wall Street Journal, whereas the Democrats trust all of the mainstream outlets a bit more than the Republicans. But the key thing is everyone agrees that the fake and hyperpartisan outlets, the orange and red ones in the lower left corner, are not trustworthy. Like Republicans, although they trust Fox the most, they still trust Washington Post, CNN, New York Times, MSNBC more than they trust Breitbart. And Democrats, although they trust Fox News the least, they still, amongst the mainstream outlets, they still trust it more than left-leaning hyperpartisan outlets like Daily Kos or Common Dreams. So this suggests that surveying lay people about how much they trust outlets could actually be a pretty successful approach for identifying low-quality outlets. And this is without having some centralized specific person or small set of people making censorship decisions. One important caveat of this, though, is that people tend to distrust anything they're not familiar with, any news sources. So this would punish reputable sources that were new or niche. So there would have to be some way of familiarizing people with content before they have them make judgments. The other thing that I want to talk about is doing some kind of nudges to get people into an accuracy mindset. Particularly on social media, people tend to be in a social mindset, not an accuracy mindset. But our research suggests if you can just get them to think a bit more about accuracy, they can actually figure out what's good content and take that into account in their sharing decisions. For example, in this particular study, we had 726 Americans look at a series of true and false headlines and indicate if they were to see it on Facebook, how likely they would be to share it. In the control condition, that's all that happens. And I'll show you the likelihood of sharing on the y-axis here. For the false headlines in red and the true headlines in blue, you see people who are only slightly more likely to say they would share true headlines than false headlines, and they would seem quite willing to share a lot of false headlines. And in the treatment, everything is exactly the same, but at the outset of the study, we asked them to judge the accuracy of a single politically neutral headline, ostensibly as part of a pretest for another study about accuracy. Then they go on to complete the same task as the people in the control condition, saying how likely they would be to share various headlines. But unlike the people in the control, these people are more likely to be thinking about accuracy and just have accuracy top of mind because they just answered that accuracy question. And we see that as a result, it makes them significantly less likely to share false headlines. And in fact, it doubles how discerning they are. That is, it doubles the difference in sharing likelihood between true and false. And this is the sort of thing that social media platforms could easily implement by, for example, having little dialog boxes pop up every so often saying, help us inform our algorithms. How accurate do you think this random headline is? They could even just throw away the answers, but just by asking those questions, it gets people into an accuracy mindset. And the reason that this works is because people in general are not purposely sharing false information. In our study, if we ask people, how important is it to you that you only share accurate articles? Basically, everyone in both conditions agrees it's very important to not be sharing misinformation. Even the people in the control who immediately beforehand indicated that they would be likely to share all this false content. So it's not that they don't care, it's just that they're not in a mindset where that is what they're thinking about. So putting these things together, I think that professional fact checkers alone are not going to be able to solve the problem of misinformation. And our research suggests that lay people are actually substantially better at assessing the quality of information and sources than you might expect, particularly if you can get them to think a little bit about it and not just go with their gut. And so I think that this provides some hope that we might be able to reduce the spread of misinformation without relying on centralized censorship institutions by taking advantage of and sort of activating people's tendency to think and consider the accuracy of the content they're consuming. And it suggests these scalable and behavioral rather than purely algorithmic solutions, which I think can be a promising part of the anti-misinformation toolkit, with the one really major caveat that all of the research that we've done so far has been using Americans and a little bit people in the UK. And we haven't looked yet beyond that. And so it's really important to assess the extent to which our findings generalize to other cultures before things like this get rolled out as interventions around the globe. So thanks very much. This is my team, and I hope this has been of interest. Please feel to reach out. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or anything else you want to discuss. Thanks.